In the early hours of a November morning in 1960, the air over Turin, Italy, was thin and bitingly cold. While the rest of the city slept, two brothers sat in a cramped makeshift laboratory, their faces illuminated only by the warm glow of vacuum tubes and the flickering needles of analog meters. Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordilia were not government agents. They were not part of any intelligence network, nor were they sanctioned by the Italian military. They were simply amateurs with an extraordinary gift for listening to things the world was not meant to hear. At the height of the Cold War, the sky was no longer a silent void. It had become a canvas for the greatest technological rivalry in human history. To the public, the space race was a series of triumphs, gleaming rockets, heroic pilots, and the inevitable march of progress. But to the brothers in Turin, the reality felt far more fragile. They had spent years perfecting a listening post they called Torre Bert, built largely from salvaged Allied surplus equipment and hand-wound coils. Their antennas were pointed toward the heavens, tuned to the specific frequencies used by the Soviet Union's space program. On that particular November night, they caught a signal that didn't match the rhythmic pulsing of a satellite or the steady telemetry of an unmanned probe. It was a sound that felt undeniably organic, a slow, labored beat. It was the sound of a heart. The brothers recorded the signal, watching the needle jump with every contraction. It was erratic, pulsing with a frequency that suggested extreme physical distress. Then, abruptly, the pulse began to fade, slowing down until it flattened into a terrifying, continuous hum. The silence that followed in the laboratory was heavy. They knew, in that moment, that they had just eavesdropped on a death. But there was no record of a launch that week. According to the Soviet news agency TASS, the heavens were empty. This was only the beginning. What the Giudica Cordiglia brothers would capture over the next few months would challenge the official narrative of the space race and leave a haunting question mark over the early years of human exploration. But that wasn't the strangest part. The heartbeats were merely a prelude to a recording that would surface in May 1961, a recording that remains one of the most chilling artifacts of the 20th century. To understand how two brothers in Italy could intercept the most sensitive secrets of the Kremlin, one must understand the unique geography of the time. The Soviet Union's primary launch site, Baikonur, was positioned in such a way that its orbital paths frequently crossed directly over southern Europe. As these spacecraft passed over the horizon, they would broadcast their status back to ground control in the USSR. Because the Earth is curved, there were windows of time where Soviet tracking stations lost line of sight with their craft. In those gaps, the signals were vulnerable. Achille and Giovanni had turned their hobby into a sophisticated intelligence operation. They had mapped the frequencies. They knew the patterns. They were listening when the world was told there was nothing to hear. Records suggest that the brothers were so accurate that even the Italian government eventually took notice, though official recognition remained elusive. There is no clear consensus on how they achieved such precision with home-built gear, but some historians believe their background in medical science allowed them to interpret biological telemetry in ways that military technicians might have overlooked. As 1961 dawned, the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union reached a fever pitch. Both nations were desperate to put a man in orbit. The pressure was immense. In the Soviet Union, the program was shrouded in a level of secrecy that bordered on the absolute. Names of lead designers were state secrets. Launch dates were never announced in advance. Successes were trumpeted, failures were erased. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became a global icon, the first human to orbit the Earth. The world celebrated. But behind the scenes, at Torre Bert, the brothers were skeptical. They had heard things in the months leading up to Gagarin's flight that didn't align with a perfect safety record. They had captured signals that suggested multiple attempts had been made prior to April 12th attempts that ended in silence. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In May 1961, just weeks after Gagarin's triumphant return, the brothers were back at their dials. The frequency was 144 megacycles. For days, they had been tracking a signal that seemed to be an orbital craft in distress. Then, the audio became clear. It wasn't the rhythmic clicking of data or the deep voice of a male pilot. It was a woman. The recording, which has since been analyzed by linguists and historians, captures a female voice speaking in Russian. Her tone is not the rehearsed, calm cadence of a pilot. It is frantic. It is the sound of someone realizing they are out of time. In the grainy, distorted audio, she can be heard complaining about the heat. "Isn't this dangerous?" she asks. "Talk to me. It is hot. I am hot." As the recording continues, her voice rises in pitch. She mentions seeing a flame. She asks if the craft is going to crash. The transmission is punctuated by bursts of static and the sound of what some interpret as the mechanical failure of the life support system. Then there is a scream. A long, drawn-out sound of terror that fades into the hiss of cosmic background radiation. The Soviet Union never acknowledged a female cosmonaut in space until Valentina Tereshkova in 1963. If the recording is authentic, it suggests a secret mission that ended in a horrific, unacknowledged catastrophe. But as with many things involving the lost cosmonauts theory, the official records of the event were never released. Some believe the recording was a hoax. Others believe it was a tragic reality hidden to protect the prestige of the Soviet state. What makes the May 1961 recording so haunting isn't just the sound of the voice, but the context of the era. The space race wasn't just about science, it was about the survival of ideologies. A single failure could be seen as a weakness of the entire system. In that environment, the individual was often viewed as secondary to the goal. Some historians believe that the Soviet program utilized phantom cosmonauts, individuals whose names were wiped from the ledgers after they failed to return. This sounds like the stuff of fiction, but we now know for a fact that the Soviet Union did erase people from history. Valentin Bondarenko, a cosmonaut who died in a training accident in March 1961, was scrubbed from official photos and records for decades. His existence wasn't acknowledged until 1986. If they could hide a death on the ground, could they hide a death in orbit? As the brothers continued their work, the signals they intercepted began to paint a picture of a program that was moving too fast, taking risks that the public could never imagine. They weren't just hearing the sounds of success, they were hearing the groans of a machine pushed beyond its limits. And that's when things began to shift. The brothers noticed that they weren't the only ones listening anymore. Strange cars began to appear near Torre Bert. Their phone lines crackled with unusual interference. The stakes had been raised. They were no longer just two brothers in a bunker. They were witnesses to a secret history. They began to wonder if the voices they were capturing were truly from space, or if they were being fed information as part of a deeper, more complex psychological game. But the recordings kept coming, and the next one they captured would be even more difficult to explain. The signals captured at Torre Bert were becoming increasingly complex. It was no longer just the sound of breathing or the frantic cries of a pilot in a failing capsule. By the end of 1961, the Giudica Cordiglia brothers began to intercept telemetry data, the digital heartbeat of the spacecraft themselves. These were sequences of pulses and tones that, when decoded, provided a window into the internal conditions of the Soviet ships. Among these intercepted transmissions was a sequence that suggested a craft had drifted off course. While the public was told that every Soviet mission was a precision-engineered success, the brothers' recordings told a story of navigational errors and desperate attempts to re-establish contact. One particular recording from early 1962 featured a rhythmic, repetitive signal that some researchers believe was an automated SOS beacon broadcast on a frequency reserved for international distress calls. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the brothers analyzed the Doppler shift of the signals, the change in frequency caused by the movement of the source, they realized that some of these craft were not orbiting the Earth. They were moving away from it. The implications were staggering. If a spacecraft fails to fire its retrorockets at the correct moment, or if it fires them in the wrong direction, it doesn't just fall back to Earth. It can be pushed into a higher, terminal orbit, or even slung out into deep space. In the early 1960s, a human being trapped in such a craft would be facing a slow, silent death, drifting into the void with no hope of rescue. Records suggest that several Soviet unmanned test flights reached altitudes far beyond what was necessary for a standard orbital mission. Some historians believe these were not tests, but failures missions where the pilot was still on board, unable to return. The brothers began to keep a meticulous log. They had photographs of their equipment, maps of the orbital paths, and reels upon reels of magnetic tape. They were aware that their claims were extraordinary, and they knew that in the world of high-stakes intelligence, proof was the only currency that mattered. Yet, as they gathered more evidence, the atmosphere around them grew increasingly cold. The Italian press began to pick up on their findings. Headlines in newspapers like Corriere della Sera began to question the official Soviet narrative. But the more the brothers spoke out, the more they were met with a wall of silence from official government channels. There was no clear consensus among Western intelligence agencies on how to handle the Turin recordings. To acknowledge them was to acknowledge that the Soviets had a capability and a willingness to take risks that was perhaps even greater than the Americans had feared. It was during this period of growing public scrutiny that the brothers captured what is perhaps their most debated recording. It occurred in November 1962. Unlike the previous frantic transmissions, this one was quiet. It was the sound of a man's voice, breathing heavily, speaking in short, clipped Russian phrases. He wasn't screaming, he was praying. The voice was low, almost a whisper, echoing against the metallic hum of the capsule. Linguists who have since studied the tape noted that the dialect was specific, suggesting a pilot from a rural region of the USSR. The transmission lasted for several minutes before it began to fragment. The Doppler shift indicated that the craft was tumbling, spinning out of control as it re-entered the atmosphere, or perhaps as it missed the atmosphere entirely. And that's when things began to shift from scientific curiosity to a sense of profound personal dread for the brothers. They were no longer just tracking satellites, they felt as though they were presiding over a graveyard in the stars. The psychological toll on Achille and Giovanni was significant. They were young men, barely in their 20s, and they were carrying the weight of secrets that the most powerful nations on Earth were trying to bury. They began to experience a form of secondary trauma, haunted by the voices of people who, officially, did not exist. They would sit in the dark, headphones pressed to their ears, waiting for a sound that they simultaneously craved and feared. What they found next, however, shifted the focus from the pilots to the people on the ground. In the mid-1960s, a series of documents surfaced through unofficial channels in Eastern Europe. These papers, often referred to as the Oberg Files, or similar collections of leaked intelligence, hinted at a secret wing of the Soviet space program dedicated to high-risk biological testing. While the Soviets publicly used dogs like Laika to test the effects of spaceflight, these documents suggested that the jump from animals to humans happened much sooner than April 1961. Some researchers suggest that the screams recorded by the brothers were the result of these premature tests. There are theories that the Soviet Union used volunteers from the military or even from the Gulag system, people whose disappearance would not be questioned. While there is no definitive proof of this, the lack of transparency in the Soviet archives from that era continues to fuel the debate. What happened next remains unclear, but the brothers' recordings remain the primary piece of external evidence that these secret missions took place. By 1964, the space race had entered a new, more professional phase. The Wild West era of early rocketry was being replaced by standardized procedures and better communication. The brothers noticed that the Soviet signals were becoming harder to intercept. The encryption was better, the frequencies were changing more frequently, and the gaps in coverage were being filled by a growing network of Soviet tracking ships stationed in the world's oceans. The window for amateur interception was closing, but before it shut entirely, the brothers captured one final series of transmissions that seemed to bridge the gap between the terrestrial and the cosmic. It wasn't a voice, it was a series of mathematical pulses. For weeks, they tracked these pulses, which seemed to be coming from a point in space that didn't correspond to any known satellite. The pulses were rhythmic, structured, and appeared to be a form of binary code. When they attempted to plot the source, they found it was stationary relative to the stars, but moving relative to the Earth. The brothers began to wonder if they had stumbled onto something even larger than a failed Soviet mission. Was it possible that the signals weren't coming from a human pilot at all? Or were they hearing a highly classified form of deep space communication that wouldn't be public knowledge for another 30 years? The escalation of their findings had reached a breaking point. They had recordings of heartbeats, of screams, of prayers, and now, of cold, mathematical logic. They decided it was time to share their full archive with a wider audience, but as they prepared to do so, they received a visitor who made them realize just how dangerous their hobby had become. The visitor didn't identify himself by agency, but his message was clear. The brothers were told that the information they possessed was not theirs. It was suggested that their continued public statements were a threat to international stability. In the delicate balance of the Cold War, a revelation that the Soviets were losing pilots in horrific accidents could have triggered a desperate and dangerous reaction from Moscow. The brothers were faced with a choice: become martyrs for a truth that no one wanted to hear, or retreat into the shadows and preserve what they had found for a future that might be ready for it. The pressure from outside forces did not silence the Giudica Cordiglia brothers, but it did change the nature of their work. They realized that they were no longer just observers. They were participants in a shadow war of information. For a time, they continued to release snippets of what they heard, but the world was moving on. The race to the moon had begun in earnest, and the sheer volume of signals coming from both Cape Canaveral and Baikonur made it increasingly difficult to isolate the anomalies. By the mid-1960s, the brothers' laboratory at Torre Bert began to feel more like a museum than a cutting-edge listening post. The vacuum tubes were being replaced by transistors, and the analog world was slowly yielding to the digital. But the recordings remained, thousands of feet of magnetic tape, stored in tin canisters, holding the potential echoes of a history that never made it into the textbooks. As the decades passed and the Cold War began to thaw, researchers started to look back at the lost cosmonaut theories with a more analytical eye. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, a flood of previously classified information reached the West. We learned about the horrific Nedelin catastrophe of 1960, where a rocket exploded on the pad, killing scores of technicians, an event the Soviets had successfully hidden for 30 years. We learned about the tragic death of Valentin Bondarenko in a high-oxygen pressure chamber fire, a death that was scrubbed from the records until the era of glasnost. These revelations proved that the Soviet Union was capable of maintaining absolute silence about its space-related tragedies. However, interestingly, the archives did not contain a smoking gun regarding the specific voices the brothers captured. No files were found with the names of a Ludmila or a Sergei who died in orbit during the specific windows the brothers identified. This has led to a deep divide among historians. Some believe that the absence of evidence in the declassified archives is proof that the recordings were a misunderstanding. Perhaps the brothers were hearing distorted transmissions from ground-based training exercises or even intercepted signals from Western experimental aircraft. Others, however, suggest that the most sensitive files, the special folders, were never released and may have been destroyed or remains buried deep within the archives of the FSB. There is no clear consensus on the authenticity of the recordings, but modern forensic analysis of the tapes has yielded some haunting insights. In recent years, audio engineers using digital restoration techniques have scrutinized the May 1961 recording of the female voice. They found that the background noise matches the specific acoustic signature of an early Vostok-style capsule. Furthermore, the physiological stress evident in the woman's voice, the rapid breathing and the shifts in pitch, is consistent with someone experiencing extreme heat and G-force. Yet, the skeptics remain. They point out that the Soviet Union didn't have the tracking capability to monitor a craft on the other side of the world, so why would a cosmonaut be broadcasting in the clear over Italy? The answer, some believe, lies in the desperation of a failing mission. If a pilot knew they were going to die, perhaps they broke protocol, broadcasting on every available frequency in a final, futile attempt to be heard by anyone anywhere. But that wasn't the end of the mystery. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers didn't fade into obscurity. They went on to have successful careers. Achille became a prominent cardiologist, and Giovanni became a renowned forensic expert. Their background in medical science and high-level technical analysis gave them a level of credibility that was hard to dismiss. They never recanted their claims. Until their final days, they maintained that what they heard was real. They weren't looking for fame. They were looking for the truth. In the late 1990s, Giovanni was asked in an interview if he ever regretted turning on those radios in 1960. He paused for a long time before answering. He spoke of the voices not as political secrets, but as human beings. He felt a sense of duty to them, a duty to ensure that their final moments weren't lost to the void. The legacy of Torre Bert remains a ghost in the machine of space history. Today, the site where the brothers once sat is silent. The antennas are gone, and the laboratory has been dismantled. But the recordings still exist. They circulate on the internet, appearing in documentaries and archives, their grainy, distorted voices still calling out from a time of shadows. Some historians believe that we may never know the full truth. The early days of the space race were a time of unprecedented risk, where the line between heroism and tragedy was often blurred by the needs of the state. It is possible that the lost cosmonauts were not just individuals, but symbols of an era where the reach of human ambition exceeded the grasp of human technology. What remains are the tapes, the rhythmic beat of a heart that eventually stops, the frantic questions of a woman who is too hot, the prayers of a man who knows he is falling. Whether these were the sounds of secret Soviet failures or the products of a strange high-tech coincidence, they serve as a reminder of the human cost of exploration. The official records of these events were never released, and perhaps they never will be. But as long as those tapes exist, the silence of the Soviet archives will never be truly absolute. We are left to wonder about the names that were never carved into monuments and the missions that ended not with a splashdown, but with a scream. The stars, it seems, have a way of keeping secrets. But sometimes, if the conditions are just right and the antennas are pointed in the correct direction, the shadows find a way to speak. And when they do, the world is forced to listen to the sounds of a history that was never meant to be heard. What happened in the cold vacuum of space in 1961 remains one of the great enigmas of the 20th century. The truth may be buried in a dusty file in Moscow, or it may be drifting hundreds of miles above our heads, a frozen capsule lost in a terminal orbit, carrying a passenger who has been waiting 60 years to come home. Until then, the recordings from Turin remain the only testimony we have, a haunting echo of the people who reached for the heavens and were swallowed by the dark.